Well, they basically, it's a form of Pashtun nationalism which is now developing in that part of the world. And lots of ordinary Pashtuns are joining this group and transforming it because they want to get rid of the occupation. We must, there are different groups in different parts of the world. Al-Qaeda is not this neo-Taliban. They are a separate group who believe in terror and organized terror. But, in order to, they are not the serious problem for the United States at the moment. At the moment, it's just a psychological problem for them. The real problem for them is the rise of the Pashtuns underneath the umbrella of the Taliban, who have now made it impossible for the United States to win this war. They can send 100,000 more troops. They're not going to win the war. Which is why I think Senator Obama is very seriously misguided in the arguments he's putting forward in this presidential campaign. And making excuses because the war in Afghanistan is going wrong, saying the reason it's going wrong is Pakistan, and let's cross over the border and create a mess there too, is not going to help. In fact, it is going to destroy the stability of that country completely, and it's in a mess anyway, as we know.
My two most reliable sources about anything that happens in Central Asia, one of them is sitting right here, Tariq Ali, and the other is my son Christian Parenti, who's been to Afghanistan about 4 or 5 times, much to my grief. But he says that the NATO forces are not leaving their barracks, except for the Americans occasionally maybe, but the Danes or Germans or whatever these other groups, they just seal up in there and barely come peek out over the sandbags from time to time.
They wait for the weekends where they organize large parties and fancy dress parties.
We're not going to win a war that way.
Well, no.
And then there's, of course, the problem of the drug traffic. The Americans imported drug traffickers into Afghanistan in 2001. They had connections with them from the 1980s, and in fact, America, in a sense, bears a very heavy responsibility for the buildup of the export of heroin out of Afghanistan. Now 93% of the world's heroin comes from either Afghanistan or the frontier provinces of Pakistan. And the bulk of U.S. aid, thanks to ISI, went to one man, Hekmatyar, who in that period was the #1 drug trafficker in the world, with his own heroin labs in ISI-controlled territory inside Afghanistan. 2001, after the Taliban for at least a year had effectively outlawed it is possible, they were able to do it, but the United States brought drug traffickers. They found one man in Dijon, France, and said, you have to come back, we're opening up the country again. And of course now the drug traffic is totally out of control of the Americans and is feeding and nourishing the Taliban. So it's...
But also, Peter, U.S. intelligence experts and drug agency experts now say that this Karzai government is also feeding off the drug trade, and that Karzai's brother is one of the biggest heroin smugglers in the country.
Yes, and they don't, of course, talk about that.
By extension, in the world, he is one, And also the fact that Russians are playing a very important role in facilitating or letting it go through their territories.
Yes.
And therefore feeding the fire that they feel that they are right now, paying back the Americans for what they had done to them. But again, I want to ask you how that plays out for the American empire in the sense of neocon agenda. What happens when unexpectedly you have these new non-state actors coming up who are going to resist and fight against you? What happens then?
I think America's gone from an offensive phase in roughly speaking, the first George W. Bush administration, to now they're just struggling to keep their heads above water. The amount of money that's gone into the war is certainly a factor in this domestic financial meltdown that we're dealing with. America cannot really be... For 50 years, starting after World War II, America's strength was based on a balance between economic dominance and military dominance. And roughly, I would say, with the Reagan era, they decided to go with military dominance and then let the free market take care of the rest. So America is now, this has happened to other powers too. It happened to Britain, it happened to the Netherlands, Spain. You're left with an army which you really can't afford anymore, and and the whole idea of controlling the world cannot be done by armies alone. It's the civilian economies that count, and here America is now visibly very weak and indebted to the tolerance of countries like China.
There are some immediate gains for the empire builders in Iraq. It allowed Bush to almost double the military budget. They went in and completely privatized the economy. They destroyed the economy, but they had special committees to privatize it. And Donald Rumsfeld, I thought he used a very amusing, interesting word. He said, it's a Stalinist economy. Everything was state-owned, so they got rid of that. They got rid of the French, Chinese, Brazilian, Italian, and Russian oil prospecting contracts that Saddam Hussein was cultivating. There's only British and American now who are on the oil.
Another thing.
And they have contracts there's about 100 companies that have made the most lucrative amounts of money on contracts in Iraq. I mean, that's the biggest profit area they've had in the last decade.
And most of them without a bidding process.
No bidding.
The biggest ones in particular. Also, Saddam was moving in his last years towards accepting, if he shipped oil to Europe, it was going to be paid in euros.
I meant to mention that.
And that a key, when I've been saying since before we went into Iraq, if you say it's all about oil, it isn't that we want in America to have the Iraqi oil. It's going to go elsewhere. America wants to have control of the global oil market and to maintain something that was worked out with OPEC and Saudi Arabia, that all OPEC oil would be paid for in dollars. Now that's very anachronistic now, and I think the collapse of the American effort in Iraq means that it's not going to endure. Iran is another country that also started to move towards paying in euros, and that's when we started to hear that America...
I want to tell a little story on that. One of the Arab American intellectuals one time told one of the Saudi princes that they should accept payment not only in dollars but in a basket of currencies, and gave him reason why they should do that. And the prince seemed to be quite impressed with that. And then he met him after a few months. He said, what came of that idea I gave you a few months ago? He said, I discussed with the American ambassador. He didn't like it. So that much for that idea. But really, coming back to the issue that we have now, yes, the hold on oil is strong. And as the big new Brzezinski in his book Game Plan had said, the only leverage you have left over Europe is control of oil. If we lose that control, we lose Europe, and they'll go in different ways, different directions. But at the same time, the prospects for increasing insurgency all over the Muslim world are increasing, not decreasing. How do you think neocons take that into account, given that they have the hold, but hold seems to be tenuous? So how are they going to make it more permanent, given that more they hold on to it, the more insurgencies they produce?
One of the things about the neocons is that they felt that it wasn't important to know very much about a country. If you had a powerful agenda, you impose it, then everything will work out. For example, Wolfowitz said, you won't have a Shia-Sunni problem in Iraq. They will all be grateful to have the Americans impose a secular government. I don't think the neocons have much depth in the area of how to relate to the Muslim world. And this is a very good reason why we should get rid of them as quickly as possible, because over and over, between the State Department and the Defense Department, I usually don't care much for either of them, but certainly what the State Department has been working for is closer to what I would want to see than the Pentagon. The neocon agenda was to create a new State Department inside the Pentagon, or when Rumsfeld left, out in Vice President Cheney's office, and to simply bypass the State Department. It's going to be very, very bad for the whole world until you eliminate the residues of that kind of alternative government that was coming out of Cheney and
But
Rumsfeld.
did you see any possibility of that in yesterday's presidential debate, that any of that is going to
No,
likely
there's
to
narrow parameters. It's very disappointing.